What would motivate a young person to willingly choose to go to war? It is a question studied by historians, creatively portrayed on stage and on film, and is the question that plagues the Department of Defense as it struggles to reach recruitment goals. Today, we continue to use words that motivated generations of warfighters in the past, like patriotism, honor, and duty. But these were not just buzzwords for our country during World War I and World War II. They were descriptors of character, a rite of passage into manhood, and for many, traits to be measured by. Today, with institutional trust at a historic low, those same words invoke political division and confusion, with many wondering if it's still a noble thing to die for one's country. If we're going to truly understand the complexity of why we find ourselves in a recruitment crisis, we must understand what these words really meant in the context of how and when they were used. With this understanding, perhaps we can decide if they are still key motivators for today's generation. If they are not, then we have bigger issues to address, and the DoD is back to the drawing board for advertising to the youngest generation. I'm Corie Weathers. You're listening to Military Culture Shift, a limited series podcast on the impact of war, money, and generational perspective on morale, retention, and leadership. While writing Military Culture Shift, I found military historian Dr. Edward Gutiérrez, who studied the values of honor and duty for specifically the World War I Doughboys, who were later labeled as the lost generation. I couldn't resist interviewing him to further the conversation on what has changed in our country since World War I. The lost generation was born after the Industrial Revolution and fought in World War I. The youngest of this generation also served in World War II as well. Nicknamed by writer Gertrude Stein, the generation's name described the disoriented, wandering spirit of veterans who survived World War I only to return to a completely different American culture. With me today, I have Dr. Edward Gutiérrez. I'm hoping I'm saying that right, Edward. He is the director of the Center for Military History and Grand Strategy at Hillsdale College. I'm so excited to talk with you, Edward, because I, in writing Military Culture Shift, became fascinated, to my surprise, with military history. I was not a history student growing up. It was not something that I leaned into, especially military history. But when it really came to understanding our story, I just really got lost in it. And I came across your work specifically on World War I. So I'm so excited for you to join this conversation. There's so much that we're going to talk about. We had great conversation even before recording. So I know this is going to be enlightening. So thank you so much, Edward, for joining.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be with you.
Well, I would love for you to share a little bit about your story, because I have a feeling it's a really unique story of how you got interested in especially military history to begin with. So do you mind just sharing a little bit of your background, your story, and how you got to this place now where you're an assistant professor there at the Department of History?
Oh, sure. I think to sum it up, the ancient Greek writer Hesiod said life is stasis, which means struggle. And I certainly believe in that. I learned that from an early age that was true. So then my whole journey, my whole quest has been trying to understand that properly. Because if you accept that, which you have to, you then are able to face it better. And I think, again, it comes down to explaining versus acceptance, and I think that's a theme that you and we've talked about in the past, and that what your great work is trying to do, and mine as well, and so many others, is trying to differentiate that, because I think modernity is very keen on trying to explain things versus acceptance. So that's really what I'm a student of and what I've been my whole life.
So being a student of, I love that phrase, life is struggle. Is that why specifically military warfare was of interest to you, or have you always loved history?
Well, so as I did, again, just from my own upbringing, and just kind of understanding. So my family and my father in particular grew up in Colombia, what was called la violencia, the violence. And so again, it just was always a matter of, I suppose, we could, nothing in life is monocausal, but there was certainly a lot of interest in being pulled too, as most young men, just again, that stasis, that struggle, and trying to understand in war and strategy, are those avenues. So, and I think history for me has always been that vehicle, because Clio, again, as the ancient Greeks called her, the muse of history, is again, it is the most instructive tool for understanding man. Because what you do is you look back, and by looking back, you get two things really, which is wisdom and humility. You don't look back, there's only one other choice. You look forward. And when you make that pivot, then you have nothing to compare yourself to. And then that's when pride and arrogance, and quite frankly, we already are disordered. Man is fallen. And so you need those anchors. And what history gives you, again, no matter what, if you want to be good at anything, just as you were saying for your great book, you had to go back. You can't it can't be tabula rasa, clean slate. You need to be a good doctor, to be a good lawyer, to be a good author, to be a good anything. You're going to have to build upon what the greats have done before you. And that's something that that's recent but it's been a slow burn over the last few centuries, certainly in the West, but really all over the globe. So again, for me, any any PhD is going to tell you, like, oh, their study is of course the greatest, of course, because what is a man but his passions. But for me, it was always, again, I think history is being that vehicle for understanding, in particular, as well as philosophy and theology for me. It's really, again, being those vehicles for, again, understanding the stasis, the struggle.
That resonates so much with me from a psychology perspective, just because I feel like I've been thinking about this a lot in the last week. How do I summarize what my personal passion is, or what I'm really driven to do? And I really feel like I'm a student of humanity. Like, I really love studying human behavior, why we make the choices that we do. And, partially because of the psychology background, it's kind of a similar, like, you can't understand a person right now, here in the present, or their drives or their motivations to even position themselves in a direction or a career like the military that puts you in harm's way, without understanding where they came from. And we're taught in psychology to go back generations to look for these patterns, these themes, the way things are passed down, these narratives that are passed down. And so when it came to really studying, like, what's going on in our military culture now, what's happening in our larger, more broader culture, you really do have to go back and look at all the things that have evolved, but also have been passed down. And so I came across your work when I was covering, especially like World War I era, and really what I was looking for, which is, I think what you were also looking into, and I'd love for you to expand on this, was what motivated. I mean, of course, the draft was going on, and a lot of people were pulled in not by their own choice, but I was really curious about what were the driving motivations of why someone would even sign up to be in the military during that time. You gave this wonderful talk, and I'm going to paraphrase some of what you were saying, but it was something along the lines of that you have to understand who they were coming in order to understand who they became. And I loved that. So would you mind sharing a little bit about why World War I? I think you've written a book on this, on the Doughboys of World War I. So why zero in on the Doughboys?
Well, first and foremost, it's, I think, two reasons. It's completely fascinating because, especially in this country, unfortunately, nobody cares about it because it's sandwiched between the Civil War and World War II. My phone was ringing off the hook during the centenary, which was 2014 to 2018. But now, again, nobody except someone sweet like you is calling me because it's like nobody wants to talk about it. It's because I knew that was going to happen. It's nothing like an anniversary to bring it back into people's minds. So I think it was always something that interested me was the why no one was talking about it. But what first truly pulled me in was the air warfare dimension, having several family members being pilots. I was always fascinated by flight and the air warfare dimension. And again, growing up with Snoopy and Peanuts, and that was one of this kind of hopeless romantic in me too. Is like really that dimension of, again, the Red Baron and flight and the honor code actually. Although there was certainly some. There's still, again, war is about putting down the other guy. It's about killing. But there was a real interesting honor and duty element and respect there that you saw in the air warfare in particular. In that war still, I think ultimately, too, it was really the crunching of the meeting of the old and new in a way. And the question I always challenge the students, and certainly myself, is, did the war make modernity, or did modernity make the war? And I will tell you, to go back to your nice point that you're making, is modernity created the war. Because of all of the quotes I found, I had 120,000 these questionnaires I found that were really after action reports with the Doughboys when they came right home in 1919. There was one gentleman, actually, he was a Canadian artillery officer, and he says more or less what you're saying. And I saw that pattern forming. And again, we're going back to as I said, my really important point about explaining versus accepting. And so what this gentleman said, Conisby Dawson, this officer, he said that it's not, war only makes what is already latent in men. Mm-hmm. So the warrior will find kind of the honor, the duty. The warrior will grow, but the coward will find cowardice. And so again, if we take it, because what we're talking about is exactly what you're saying. Like, I am also a student of human nature. So what we've done is we keep compartmentalizing and labeling these things as war. So if I say, like, what is life? You see how we got to go higher than that. We got to go to this grand strategic level. Because if we're just talking about war, again, what we're really talking about is life. Mm-hmm. And so again, we're talking about bad things, but are they really bad? Again, it's how you face them. So it's not what happens to you; it's how you deal with it. So that's really, again, what I was trying to get to.
And I'm hearing that a man's response to trauma, if we're going to call wars, if we're going to experience something that's traumatic, not only can we learn what motivates people to come in or sign up for something like that, but also how they come out of that. If there is trauma that they experience, or suffering, if we use life as suffering, right? How we experience suffering. I'm hearing you say that it's really about what we bring into that suffering in the first place determines how we move out of it.
Correct. Yeah, correct. And I don't think, again, I think even the way it's moving out of it, I don't know if that's even the right way to again, about the acceptance. Mm-hmm. So in your discipline, there's been a move in the positive psychology movement and post-traumatic growth studies to really start to reflect on how, again, that very, very laden word of trauma. So you see, it's in World War I, we went into that war again since the dawn of man. War is something that can be ennobling. It's brutal. As William Tecumseh Sherman said, and this is why so many of the Doughboys quoted General Sherman from the Civil War. War is hell. But everyone always quotes just that. They just quote that, Corie. Mm-hmm. And see, people cherry pick that. But what Sherman said right after that is, and if it comes, I'm here. Mm. So you see, again, so here's one who gave the hard hand of war and was so instrumental in winning, along with Grant, the Civil War and defeating the Confederacy. That's the important point. So you have, coming into World War I, this pivot point that had already been building towards that already, though, within the 1800s and even before that. Again, because what we need to be talking about is, I think we got to be careful about labeling something as defining it as being evil or bad or good or something of that nature, because ultimately, see, again, we're back to life is a struggle. Mm-hmm. And so again, loss, death, whether it be financial or any physical, anything, that's what it comes down to. And I think what's the real key is that threshold is so lower now because we just don't preach virtue and resilience anymore, or it's only preached in a very small corridor.
Do you feel that the Doughboys or the World War I era had more of that?
Absolutely. Absolutely, because again, it's nature. Seneca, the ancient Roman philosopher Seneca, said it best when he's talking about virtue. He says, "We're born for it, but not with it."
Mm.
So first and foremost, again, you're talking about nature and nurture, and it's again how you define what man is and what the subject matter, what is he made of, and what's he able to endure, and what's the whole point. See, we're into the big questions here again. What's the point, and why are we here? But also the nurturing, as Seneca says, things need to become habitual and need to be trained. And so, if you have a society that instantly is labeling something as traumatic or bad or evil or broken, then you're going to create a society that accepts that versus one that's able to say, oh, okay, we need fortitude, need resilience, and we have this. So that's really the key, is that the Doughboys, and it's not to say there wasn't some, like men throughout history, there's obviously, as you well know with your specialty, that everyone's unique, and that so. But the important point is, if someone experiences one thing versus someone else, there's thousands upon thousands of Doughboys, combat veterans, who saw very, very intense combat. Again, that was hell, but I'm glad I did it. Made me a man. It was my duty. It was my honor. Even the ones that were drafted, I gladly answered the call. But the problem is, those veterans, they are the voices we don't hear. We hear the lost generation. It's always rather than the deserving voices, it's always the ones that are the most creative or the loudest. So we define the war now through the Hemingway, the Fitzgerald, again, the lost generation, or just that narrative that we've created and constructed, which is, it was a horrible conflict. It was destructive. It was this, it was that. And it is, again, as this kind of negative, dark, which is, again, was how we label all wars. So I think, again, you can kind of see the point is that we've pivoted in our understanding of war, but again, of what is life.
Well, and this is what really stood out to me about this generation or this era, and why I thought it was so important to cover. And obviously, why you thought it was so important to really study is, if we're going to talk about, which I definitely think we, in just a minute, need to talk about where we are today and what's evolved. But when I looked back and I was really trying to answer the question that I was often getting from military leaders today, which is what are the driving motivations of the current generation, especially millennial and Gen Z? And, and of course, in the military, we throw around these words of honor, duty, sacrifice, patriotism, and all that. But every time I would come across those words, I'm like, something has changed. Those words don't mean today what they meant before. And it seemed like, please, shed some light on this, but it just was a code to live by. And so you referenced a moment where you were going through the museum with looking at artifacts from the Titanic as being like this key moment. So would you mind sharing that? Because I think that it relates to this whole idea of it being infiltrated in the culture.
Sure. So I grew up believing that narrative. So we're saturated with it. It's on so many syllabi, and just how so many will approach the war. Again, film directors are the historians of modernity. So the movies, if you just think of the movies of the war, with the exception of 1917, which recently came out, which was very good, a film about the Great War. But I grew up kind of believing that. But then it was, what had happened is and when I really dug into it, and it was the soldiers themselves, as I said, over 120,000 Doughboys, and I realized, woo, I was wrong. So it was the one moment, So I was very blessed. I had a Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation. I was a fellow. I received a grant, and I was in the World War I Museum, which is in Kansas City. And across the street is this fabulous old train station, and it has that kind of neo-classical architecture, huge, beautiful building. And in the basement, it's just, I don't believe in coincidence, there was a Titanic anniversary. It was 2012. So it was the anniversary of the sinking of the Titanic. And I'm going through the really fabulous exhibition, And at the very end, there was a quote there, and I was embarrassed to say, as I've said many times, I had forgotten that a Guggenheim was on the boat, and when she went down, and they had this quote on the wall that said, "We're dressed in our best and prepared to go down like gentlemen." And so I really dug into and studied the sinking of the Titanic, because I think, again, as far as quotes kind of representing an era, that is so very true. That Guggenheim and his valet were in their white tie, and they died. And it's important to note how orderly that the majority of men face that, and women, against in general. So many of the engineers and the electricians, they kept her afloat for an extra 90 minutes. They all drowned down in below decks. The orchestra did indeed keep playing until she went down. So you have this sense, again, really talking about, because what we were talking about is love and death. Mm-hmm. And it's where you direct your love and how you embrace death. And those are so important, because what you're talking about, I wouldn't even say, I don't want to pin anything on the modern generations, or so to speak, because I've seen it everywhere. And again, this is across cultures, across countries, race, everything. It doesn't age, it doesn't really matter. I think if we were to pinpoint it, I would blame it on three things: godlessness, technology, and materialism. Mm-hmm. And so if I just could briefly just unpack those, I'll be as taut as possible, I think. So godlessness, first and foremost, is once you abandon God, you become God. So Dr. Kissinger wrote a great book on leadership recently. And he really concludes by saying, kind of going what you were talking about, top down with virtue. Dr. Henry Kissinger says the same thing, that you need, he says, you need something at some level in society to come together. So there's got to be something to bind it. The best for that is an absolute. Because if you don't have an absolute, you're going to pivot again away to picking, where do I answer the big questions of what is virtue? What is honor? Where does it come from? Again, like under what criteria are you measuring it, and where does it come from? So that's what you have to beat that sense of pride we all have. And if you don't have an absolute, that makes it extremely, extremely difficult to define who you are and just, again, the big questions. The second is technology. Specifically, technology has always been an issue, but it's a tool. Technology has always been, throughout history of man, a tool. And I can use any technology to better mankind or to destroy it. The big pivot that I've seen in my reflection in particular is the cyberspace, we could just call it. So that's in the internet, social media, and all of that, and cell phones. Mm-hmm. Because you just open the newspaper, open the Wall Street Journal any day, and this is what I'm saying. It's not just something in the West or in our country. Everywhere around the world, you're going to see people glued to that device that are living in this false world. And again, to your discipline, but in the hard sciences, we are rewiring our neurological pathways. And it also, as I said, I think going back to that godlessness is really what you're talking about. I mean, think about it. Does someone really care what I had for dinner? Or when I'm taking a selfie, just that whole term, I'm taking a selfie. Just think about it, Corie. I'm taking a selfie at the Eiffel Tower, at Notre Dame Cathedral, or anywhere. What the selfie says is, I am more important than the event. Mm-hmm. So it's not just being there in the beauty of the Sistine Chapel or the Great Wall of China. It's here I am, and see it. So it's this exhibitionism. So you can see how that ties into the godlessness. And lastly is materialism, which, again, it's this trifecta, because Marxism in particular is what started this in the 1800s, but it's this project that started with the Enlightenment, which is the turn to the subject. So you see everything, if I don't have that spiritual guidance, if I don't have the metaphysic, the absolute concepts that guided man throughout his history, then I'm going to focus on everything here. And that might be, again, the cell phone, or just everything that has matter. So if I truly believe there's nothing, or I don't have the really solid doctrinal concepts of an absolute with religion, then I'm going to pivot down. Mm-hmm. And so you see, again, it's where I'm directing my love. And see that, again, we're back to, as I stressed, our whole wonderful conversation about those choices about how we face stasis. We either explain it or we accept it. And that's the answer to that question hinges on, as I said, those three key understandings of why I think we're, as you're rightly saying, why your work is so important, is we're in trouble.
Mm-hmm.
And you can either shrug that off and keep trying to, again, explain, or you can accept it and you have to then say, okay, well, why did we get here in this way? And I'm not trying, again, I think it's really important. Again, historians are certainly labeled as being nostalgic or romantic. I am not one to tell you that there hasn't been, I mean, man has fallen again, and we've done a lot of terrible things throughout history. But what I do see, as you rightly are saying, there's a very large difference, again, in how individuals, why they serve, why they do what they do. And it's not just, again, the military. We can't point all the fingers at the military. The important thing is the military is an extension of the society that it comes from, just like medical care or the White House or Congress or the education system, all of it. It doesn't matter. Again, I remember once I was on a staff ride and a colonel in '06 was lamenting just to what you're talking about. And we got into this big talk with all the other officers, and we were saying just that, is that we came to that conclusion. And I was really stressing that point, is that we can't expect the military to somehow be above it when our own society is not like that. If you're asking, what, 1% that served in Iraq and Afghanistan to then somehow not react or just to be kind of immune to that. See, that's my whole point, is we've divorced war from society so completely, and it's not the warrior's fault, it's society's fault.
No, I love that perspective so much. And a lot of what I was trying to trace throughout the shifts that have happened in the culture, especially since 9/11, was really what globally we were going through as far as the impact of social media and the internet shifting. And I mean, even going back, even before that, there's just all these subtle shifts in our society of closing in and becoming more and more isolated into their homes. I took a lot of those shifts that I was happening and then looked at how does that impact the subculture of the military. But I love your perspective on, how do you shift, change, evolve something when it's only 1% of the greater culture? So I kind of want to ask you what you think about that, because, it sounds like, we can't do anything, but surely there is a, how do we lead from where we are and the influence that we have personally? So I'm kind of jumping probably to what I would ask you towards the end, but what are your thoughts on the ability, or our maybe personal ability, to shift that somehow?
Well, I think it's important that we live in a society too that loves to pull down but never offer a counterpoint. I think if you're going to attack the position, you need to offer that position. So it's a great question. And first and foremost, we need to go back to a way of cultivating virtue. And again, the problem is, as you and I have been talking, as I've said, just with the godlessness, technology, and materialism. So I, for one, would argue that we're fighting a rearguard action. So, for example, again, it's Pandora's jar, to make another Greek reference. Once you've let something out, it's very difficult then to put it away without actually force and oppression, so to speak, because you have to. So it's a tall order, but the most important thing is having a culture that is much more geared towards understanding and wisdom. And wisdom, again, is only gleaned from the past, from your forefathers, from tradition. It's ethics versus politics. Life should be ethics and then politics much later, but we've inverted that. It's right versus good. And so we live in a society, again, it's my right to do X. So they have no conception of the do, as St. Thomas Aquinas would call it. And so it's a very, again, ancient and medieval kind of mindset to say something, because you're going back to your great points about honor and duty. And so everyone, again, if we have a culture and a society that believes I'm doing this, or I'm expected to, or I receive this because it's my right, versus is it good? So one example that for you and I, let's look at our generation. You and I grew up when marijuana was illegal. Now, why why would someone not do it? So you have to say it's immoral. It's versus is it the law? So now we have a society which half the country now it's legal, and you see how that dilutes it, because if you're basing everything on quote unquote rights, you can see how those change very, very quickly. So we're back to my most important point about absolutes. Absolutes have to govern man. You need something above just the way times change, because it can change so rapidly. Because I could easily, with that argument, Corie, I could say, oh, it wasn't the Nazis' fault. They were just a product of their time. You see, so because again, it's like, well, they didn't understand because they're not as advanced or as sophisticated as we were. so you see that's the line of argument we have today. Because, well, rights are going to get even better. We're going to develop even better. And so to your great point, with that nice book, that The Calling of the American Mind, that was co-authored, I remember, by a lawyer or and your discipline, again, a psychologist.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's the wedding you kind of see of those two. See, you need both is the point too. You need ethics and you need politics. You need the laws because, again, life is struggle. People are looking for the majority of man throughout history. And again, not just in America, just in general. How do I get from A to B as quickly as possible?
Mm-hmm.
And so again, I keep quoting the ancients, but you see, again, as a historian, this is what Cicero said, that life is the choice between the ethical versus the expedient. And so again, it's the longer, harder road, which is the good road. That's the ethical road that Cicero is talking about. Then I can do the expedient. How do I get, again, and as you said, think about it, we are in a culture, it just, give it to me now, bam, 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 15-second videos, swish, 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 it's speed, it's now. There is no time to think. To answer, again, your immensely important question is, the only way to do that is to slow down. We got to take our foot off the accelerator and start concentrating on what made man, us, again, globally, great, which is the study of the past and really having a society that cultivates virtue, that cultivates honor, and not to make them dirty words. But you see, it's such a tall order because we're going back to, again, as I said, my kind of trinity, which is that godlessness, technology, and materialism. Those are so ingrained within our DNA now that it's a tall order, but the only way that comes from, again, that has to come from society. It's the same thing as I said with the military, of anyone else. We can't expect the president or any leader to somehow be above that. I mean, virtue is, as you absolutely said, it's top down. But every single country throughout history receives the leader they deserve because it's from that society. So again, you can see that ultimately it's got to be bottom up. It comes from both directions, but it has to be cultivated from our society. So it's a huge problem. I think it can be done, but that's the pivot that must happen.
Well, this is a lofty dream, but I'm hoping that Gen Z will consider that being their thing worth fighting for and their thing worth championing. I think they're definitely coming back and seeing the limitations of technology, even though they're embracing lots of things like the virtual world and all that. There's a part of them that's coming back and saying, like, we're missing human connection and that technology can't be the answer for everything.
Yeah.
Right. Maybe as a metaphor, I can share what happened to me this morning. I was taking my son to school and I was sharing with him about a friend of mine who reached out to me, and she was going through like this parental turmoil because yesterday her son punched another kid at school. And I'm laughing because last year my son punched a kid at school and we had to go through that and we had to talk about it and whatever. And I was humorously trying to lighten the mood because I mean, as parents, I think we go through situations like that and assume it says something about us, and maybe partially it does, but how we handle that, I think, is so important and such a great opportunity for everybody to grow through something and redefine some of the things I think we're even talking about right now. But I was lightheartedly messaging my friend to say, hey, if it makes you feel any better, my kid punched a kid at school last year, and now he's running for student president. So there's a way to evolve from here. But I was talking to my son about that this morning, and we had this whole interesting conversation. He's in high school, so he's a younger Gen Z, but we were having this conversation about how the school systems handle situations like that. I said to him, I think that the school as a whole has to decide what are those values? What are the ethics? What do we stand for? And if everybody were in agreement, everything from students all the way up to staff, up to the principal, up to the district, that this is who we are. This is what we believe in. These are the values that are important to us. And you're agreeing by coming to this school that you also value those things. We're seeing in some pockets of some districts in the country where students are policing themselves because they so value what that environment stands for and what's important to them and how they treat each other. It just brought me to this place of, I don't know if we have those agreed upon values where, to your point, everybody is thinking about what their personal rights are, even down to when we talk about the motivation of military today. One of the advertisement for military recruiters is come join the military where you can find a sense of purpose, like as if this is a self-purpose path for you. And that's what the job is. So I'm not sure, maybe that's a wrong metaphor, but it's just kind of my thinking on, we don't have shared values as much anymore.
So this, as I was saying, I was quoting Dr. Kissinger. So one big problem is you've used that label. And again, it's not your fault. We love labels.
Yeah.
And by labeling generations, we are literally divorcing ourselves from each other. Mm-hmm. So think about the 20th century. It was the first time again in history where we put a definitive label on every decade. That is a very big problem. The 20s were this, the 30s were that, the 40s were this, the 60s were this, the 70s were that. And then all of a sudden you obviously meant, and I know for us, and for so many who witnessed it, that 9/11 is seared into our retina on that very, very difficult day. But the bigger one is the Cold War. That in 89, when the wall fell in 89, 90, 91, there was this sense of euphoria that we won. Democracy defeated communism. But I think we really lost the Cold War because it was there. If you think about that pivot that happened, as you were saying, the 90s in particular, obviously very different from the 80s, but you're starting to kind of see the problem. Is again, the issue is old equals stale. Great example again. Here I go with the ancients again, but ancient Romans had death masks on their doorway of their dead relatives. So every day I'd walk out of the door and say, all right, great grandpa, got to honor you. Got to hold it up. I got to see again. You see, I'm looking back. So this is something, again, if you look at scripture in Genesis, it's the binding that between Abraham and Isaac, what binds the generations? That is so important. Now, what does? What binds the generations? Again, if it's not that, as Dr. Kissinger is saying, as I was mentioning earlier, it's got to be the absolute. There has to be something that binds us together. And now it's always, again, you can see the difference. It's in the ancient medieval mind, what I would want something traditional, what's old, because old is proven, new is unproven. Think of how different that is now. What phone do you have? Oh, you got the 6. Oh, did you listen to that song? That was so yesterday. See how ingrained we are to think like that. So one of the most important things we need to do is get rid of all of this gen labeling.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I feel super convicted about it. But I really do, because you answered a question that I was going to ask you, coming from like a devil's advocate perspective of, what if somebody is listening right now and they're saying, well, you're just part of a previous generation that has your view and you're not, rolling with, what's happening now, whatever somebody might say. And I think you answered that so wisely. And you're right. I can see how, and I am saying right now that I'm going to shift my language because By saying what I said, it positions this younger generation to fix everything. And for me, as an older generation, to sit back and enables me to do less when really there should be more wisdom. And I will say, there's still so much room for wisdom and mentoring. People still want mentoring. And there's wisdom. And I can hear you also saying that's part of honoring the past. But I do feel like what we are both saying is we've got to close the gaps between all of them, that we've got to find common language, common motivation, common ability to work together and see each other's value. That is for sure the biggest message that I feel like is, for me at least, the most important thing, is to bring people together.
Exactly, because again, this is a slippery slope. And see, we see how we're back to the most important fundamentals. As I said, I would challenge anyone to then reflect on, okay, well, what binds us then? Because that's the key issue. Because it's going to get worse and we're in such a very, very unstable time in the sense with artificial intelligence, and just technology is getting more and more powerful. Well, again, how do you govern that? We're back to the same thing: ethics versus politics. I can make all the laws in the world, but if I don't have ethics, then, and again, where are you getting your ethics from? Under what source? What is the font of your code of ethics? Now, if that keeps changing every quote unquote generation, and we're back to what we'll have a generation AA, double B, or whatever it might be, you see, there's where the binding is not happening. And that is the biggest issue right there. Is we all, as I said, any ancient or medieval is going to be able to relate to their grandfather or their great grandfather.
And especially with 1% serving, where people are more and more disconnected from the warrior culture.
Yes.
Whereas before, people knew a grandfather, knew an uncle, a brother, someone who served. And I think with the time that we have left, I just want to reflect on that for a second. We talked previously before this call. We talked about just suffering and detachment from the warrior culture, and that not necessarily being taught in the everyday life. And so can you share a little bit about how you've seen that evolve? As far as not just suffering, but being willing to embrace being maybe a warrior, or, I mean, you said in the very beginning, talking about, I think you were referencing just men in particular leaning into or being pulled towards war or suffering or strategy, that sort of thing, as being more of an everyday thing than I feel like we're experiencing today.
Oh, sure. I think that, again, if we just use your great analogy with your son, where I went to school when I was his age, the boys' bathroom was a war zone. Yeah. When you went to the boys' bathroom, you're going to get jumped. Right. Now, some could say, see, again, you see how we're back to, we're at the strategic level here, because then you have to say, well, is that a good or bad thing? I mean, everybody wants the golden road, of course. But at the same time, see how we're back to the explanation versus the acceptance. And then it's a matter of, okay, what are you going to do about it? So I can say, well, again, boys fight. Everyone fights, though. And so then it's a matter, again, of how, you see, we're back to those really important fundamentals of the big questions. What is life? What's the point? Why are we here? And those, if you can't answer those, as you said, as you nicely started this, as you and I were both agreeing, we're students of human nature. But those questions have to be answered with the past, because if, again, the issue here is, if you take the modern viewpoint that we're somehow progressing and getting better and better, it really then becomes a question of why even bother? Why even bother? Because well I'm going to be outdated in 10 years, so, or even less than that. So why, again, like, what's the point? So it's an impossible position to hold, because it just implodes upon itself. So I think that the kind of it all kind of, again, stems back to the important, the big lessons of life, which is facing what life is. And as I started with Hesiod, I think it's stasis. And once you accept that, you're going to realize that man was built to endure, and he's built to suffer. And that's just life. I mean, that's part of the challenge. Because if you don't have any challenge, then you're never tested, and life's very different. I could give you one good reference. Christine de Pizan. She was probably the first a lot of people like to say she's the first modern writer, but she was writing during the time of the 100 Years' War against France and England. And she writes so much. She wrote for women of guidebooks, but also just men. She wrote on chivalry. She was brilliant polymath, and she was really saying very much what I'm saying too. And she was saying, ladies, we're in the time of war, and this is an immense time in France of suffering. It was called the chevauchée. So you have, much like Ukrainians are enduring that. The war zone is the front line. It's your front door. And so she's writing and telling these women, it doesn't matter what happens to you. It's how you deal with it. So you see, she's taking that absolute standard that, again, we have to take, because otherwise the alternative is it becomes situational. Well, then there's, okay, no, I can't handle this because this happened. Or, well, it depends on this situation. It's not writing it off, suffering, or anything of, again, the badness of life. But it's so important to understand how you face that. And how you face it is going to be determined, again, by those high-level questions to answering. What's your worldview? Mm. How you approach life is going to approach how I face war, how I face death, how I face going into the boys' bathroom when I'm your son's age. Mm-hmm. So I think that's really the important point.
Well, I think this is important for everybody listening, especially if you are parents, if you are really, if you're just taking a look at your own life and going through whatever struggle you're going through right now, whatever you're facing, I think it is asking ourselves those hard questions. And then as parents, what is it that we believe as parents, and how are we instructing them with that common understanding of how do we move through suffering? When I'm working with people, I think of life, and I think of our individual lives almost like a novel that's being written. And so when suffering happens, and it's going to happen, sometimes it's a whole separate chapter, but that doesn't mean, we can skip that chapter. It doesn't mean that we can erase that chapter. It's just part of our story. And chapter 7 doesn't happen the way that it happens without chapter 3 being a part of how you got there. Yeah. And so I think when you use that word embrace, like embrace the suffering, embrace that it's part of our story. It's a part of being human. And I hear you saying we have to decide what we believe about suffering and believe about God and technology and materialism and all of that in order to move through it with wisdom, but move through it with maturity, so that we do have something, I think, to pass down. I think in closing, my last question for you, you are teaching, we're not going to give a label. So you're teaching young people and, right. And having the chance to really inspire, people who are in this world and living through all of this. I mean, this is a generation who came up in technology, whereas I think you're of my generation where we didn't have that in our childhood, maybe in our adolescence. So how are you teaching these kids, these students, to go out into the world? And what are you seeing their reaction being?
Well, again, it comes down to a question of caring. As I tell any student, if you don't care, you can't expect me to. Mm. So that's really the important point, is that the conversation we just had, I'm sure there's going to be lots who disagree with that, but a lot who I hope would agree and would read your work and would embrace that and start to reflect on, maybe I need to rethink and refocus the lens on what's really important. So I think the best way to answer your great question is, again, a story from antiquity. So in the Iliad of Homer, on the very end, Achilles and Priam are talking everything we just talked about. And Priam is devastated because his son Hector has died, not to mention so many other the Trojans. And Achilles has this great line where he tells the story about Niobe. And we don't have to get into the mythology, but the point is, he says Niobe still ate. So his big point, Achilles is really saying exactly what you and I have been saying, and what I started this with is, when you look back, you realize that men and women throughout history have suffered a lot more than you have.
Mm-hmm.
And that, again, you see how that's the point. If I don't do that, I have nothing to compare myself to. So that's the most important point. You see, again, you bring the horse to the well, but you can't force him to drink.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the thing, again, we're not into, it's such a modern idea to say, I am not the agent of my actions. I was tricked. I was duped by the government.
I appreciate you saying that, because when I looked throughout history and how it impacted and moved people, I had that same thought, but I felt like, am I even allowed to say that?
No, of course you're not. No, of course you're not, Corie. See, that's the problem. See, because we've taken that away. See, we're back to the right versus the good. Because I can think about the culture we live in. It's so very much rewarded to point the finger and say, I'm not where I'm supposed to be because it's your fault, or it's this or that. Mm-hmm. And it's not that we want to take away anyone's journey, but we have to very much remember every action is a moral action. That's a very tall order that St. Thomas Aquinas sets for us. And so many, again, men from men and women from the past. But back to that lesson that Achilles is trying to teach Priam. This happened, and even worse happened to someone else. So you see what it does is it doesn't make you feel like we do today, everybody gets a trophy.
Yeah.
Like, no, there's individuals that have endured a heck of a lot worse than you have. And maybe they've got something to teach you. But you see, that's the most important thing that we also have the problem with, to your great point. I can, and people can listen again to this, our wonderful podcast here, and God willing, they'll nod their heads and go, you know what, that's a great point. Or they might just say, that's rubbish. There's nothing you can do about it. So that's the really problem is, again, we're back to the Dr. Kissinger's point. What's going to bind us? What we need something. And so we need to be cultivating a culture that, which again, it wasn't, this is the way life has always been until very recently. As I said, certainly, again, the real problem is kind of that turn of the century, as I was stressing. Modernity made the Great War more than the war made modernity. Because you see, again, there it is. It's the war's fault. Mm-hmm. It's the war's fault that because of this, because of X, Y, and Z. Aha. But if you look at the art, you look at the literature, you look at the cultural turn before 1914, we're already heading in that direction.
Yeah.
So we're back to that that fundamental point, which you kindly brought up, that I think if you were to take away one thing from my first book on the Doughboys, which would be it's that wonderful quote by Conisbee Dawson, that, again, war just makes blatant what a man already, what he is. You know, he's already forged going in. And so that's what we need to really work on, is tempering ourselves in a lot stronger way.
Can't regret it if you never.
And people don't realize what they have. They bitch about it. And then nowadays, I am so upset that the things we did, and the things we fought for, and the boys that died for it, it's all gone down the drain. Our country's gone to hell in a handbasket. We haven't got the country we had when I was raised. Not at all. Nobody will have the fun I had. Nobody will have the opportunity I had. It's just not the same. That's not what our boys, that's not what they died for.
While studying The Lost Generation, I spent hours trying to find footage of World War I veterans talking about why they willingly signed up for war. Of those I could find, their answer was simply that they wanted to go, many of them making their decision before their parents could talk them out of it. Perhaps we have been asking the wrong question all along. Maybe instead of asking what motivates an individual to serve their country, maybe we should be asking what would motivate an individual to not.
You can't grieve it if you never lost it. You can't reject it if you never owned it.
The military culture Culture Shift podcast is sponsored by New Res Home Mortgages and written and produced by me, author, speaker, and military clinical consultant Corie Weathers. It is a supplemental leadership podcast for the book Military Culture Shift, the impact of war, money, and generational perspective on morale, retention, and leadership, aimed to invite discussion in order to consider productive solutions for our nation's security and force of service members and their families. Copies of the book can be purchased on Amazon, militaryfamilybooks.com, and your other favorite retailers. Our closing song is Regrets by Moda Spira, and more information, including graphs, data, and other resources mentioned in the book, can be found on my website, corieweathers.com.
I can't predict it if I never saw it.
And when